Psychopath's colony of Leros was a 1957 royal mandate designed for one purpose: the total social erasure of the incurable. The Greek state repurposed abandoned 1930s Italian naval barracks in the Lepida area, a location chosen for its geographical isolation. In 1958, the first transport of 300 patients arrived by naval vessel. Men and women who were stripped of their clothes, their identification papers, and their human status. They were assigned serial numbers that were tattooed or written on their forearms. By 1961, the PICPA facility was integrated, specifically to house children with severe congenital disabilities. These children were kept in cages made of rusted iron bed frames flipped upside down. The staff were not medical professionals. They were uneducated islanders hired as guards. There were no doctors on site for the first 5 years of operation. The architecture was a weapon. Vast, unheated stone halls with high ceilings that echoed the screams of those undergoing hydrotherapy, a polite term for being hosed down with freezing seawater in the winter months. Malnutrition was a systemic tool of control. Patients were fed a calorie-deficient mash of bread and oil, leading to a population of human skeletons who roamed the grounds. The mortality rate in these early years was suppressed by the state, but anecdotal evidence from former guards suggests that unclaimed bodies were buried in unmarked trenches behind the barracks. This was an industrialized system of neglect, where the budget for psychiatric care was diverted into the pockets of local administrators, leaving the patients to rot in a maritime vacuum. The Leros model was not about healing, it was about the biological storage of the unwanted until they reached their natural expiration date. When the Greek military junta seized power in 1967, Leros was transformed into a dual-layered hellscape of psychiatric and political repression. The hospital's capacity was artificially inflated to 2,650 beds, making it one of the largest concentrated populations of mental defectives in Europe. Simultaneously, the grounds became a detention center for over 2,000 political dissidents. This created a zone of silence protected by military law. Anyone who spoke about the conditions inside risked being declared insane themselves. This era saw the rise of the infamous Pavilion 16, the ward of the wretched. In Pavilion 16, patients were kept in total darkness to minimize agitation. Because the state refused to fund clothing, over 500 men and women lived in permanent, collective nakedness. They were housed in former ammunition depots with concrete floors that were never cleaned. Patients slept in their own excrement, leading to chronic skin rot and pica, a psychological disorder where the starving inmates consumed plaster, dirt, and their own hair. Medical treatment was limited to high-voltage electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, administered without anesthesia, often used as a punishment for disobedience. The political prisoners held in the neighboring blocks reported hearing the mechanical hum of the ECT machines running through the night. The junta utilized the psychiatric staff to break political exiles, using heavy doses of thorazine to induce chemical lobotomies. This was a laboratory of human suffering where the boundaries between political dissent and mental illness were intentionally blurred. The guards patrolled the perimeter with clubs, and any patient who attempted to approach the sea was beaten back. The naked wards became a self-sustaining ecosystem of trauma, where the lack of sensory input led to institutional autism, a state where patients simply rocked back and forth for decades, staring at the gray stone walls until their eyes glazed over permanently. Following the fall of the junta, the asylum didn't close, it simply grew more invisible. By the late 1970s, Leros was a town within a town, its economy entirely dependent on the human warehouse. The restless wards were established during this period, housing those who had developed violent tendencies due to decades of confinement. The primary method of control was the chain. Documented reports from visiting psychologists in the early 1980s found patients with heavy iron shackles bolted to their bed frame. These chains were often so short the patients could not stand upright. Sedation was industrialized. Nurses would walk through the wards with large cocktail syringes, injecting any patient who made noise with a mixture of haloperidol and chlorpromazine. This led to the Leros Shuffle, a collective side-to-side gait caused by the permanent neurological damage of over-medication. There were no chairs, no tables, and no utensils. Food was dumped into communal metal troughs, and the strongest patients would fight for the scraps, while the catatonic starved to death in the corners. The PICPA ward for children was even worse. Infants were tied to their cribs with torn bed sheets to prevent them from scratching their own eyes out. Because there was no laundry service, the sheets were rarely changed, leading to ammonia burns on the children's skin that became permanently scarred. The staff spent their shifts in locked offices drinking coffee, while the trustees, slightly more functional patients, were given clubs to keep the others in line. This was a hierarchical system of brutality where the patients ran the asylum under the cold, indifferent eye of a corrupt administration. The data from this period shows that the mental health budget was spent on luxury cars for hospital directors, while patients died of simple, treatable dysentery. The wall of silence finally crumbled in 1989 when a team of British journalists and activists infiltrated the island under the guise of tourists. They captured the rawest footage in the history of psychiatry, images that the BBC eventually broadcast to a horrified global audience. They found the ward of the naked, where 500 human beings were living in a state of nature, their skin leathered by the sun encrusted with filth. The journalist documented the cage of Leros, where a young man had been kept in a wooden box for 5 years because he was hyperactive. The footage showed children with primitive behaviors, biting, clawing, and eating dirt, because they had never been taught to speak or interact with humans. The international medical community was paralyzed by the data. Leros was receiving millions of ECUs, European currency units, in subsidies meant for modernization, yet not a single penny had reached the wards. The outrage was so severe that the European Union issued an ultimatum. Greece would be stripped of all healthcare funding and potentially sanctioned unless Leros was immediately reformed. The journalist noted that the patients didn't even react to the cameras. They had lost the concept of other people. They were shadow humans, existing in a pre-verbal state of constant terror and neglect. The scandal exposed a systemic failure of European human rights, proving that a concentration camp for the disabled had operated in plain sight for over 30 years. The Observer called it Europe's guilty secret, and the images of naked men huddled together for warmth in the Mediterranean winter became the symbol of institutional evil. The data collected by the investigative team showed that mortality rates in Pavilion 16 were 400% higher than in any other Greek hospital, with the majority of deaths occurring during the cleaning days when the freezing seawater hoses were used. The reform of Leros was almost as brutal as the confinement itself. In 1990, under intense EU pressure, international teams of psychiatrists, nurses, and social workers were dropped onto the island. They found a population of psychological ghosts who were terrified of clothes, beds, and silverware. The Leros 1 and 2 projects attempted to move the patients into community hostels, but the transition proved fatal for many. For decades, these people had been identity locked to their stone cells. The sudden cessation of heavy sedation and the introduction of freedom caused massive physiological shocks. Data from 1991 shows a spike in cardiac arrests among the Pavilion 16 survivors as their bodies struggled to adapt to a non-sedated state. Many patients refused to leave the barracks, crawling back into the dark corners when the doors were finally open. By 1994, the main human warehouse was officially declared empty, and the survivors were scattered across Greece into small group homes. However, the psychological damage was permanent. Most remained non-verbal until their deaths. The barracks at Lepida were left to rot, their stone walls still stained with the pica marks of those who tried to eat the plaster. Today, the Leros Asylum is a ghost site that serves as a grim reminder of what happens when a state decides a certain class of people is subhuman. The asylum isn't just a place, it's a mindset of exclusion that reached its peak on this Greek island. The records of the thousands who died there are still largely lost or unclassified, ensuring that the full scale of the Leros body count remains the ultimate history asylum mystery. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more madness.